So, Libby, I fell into a creek this week, and I was a little embarrassed because our producer, Alec, was with me and saw the whole thing. I was hoping he would fall in at some point, too. So there was a log across the stream at one point.
Wow, just so to save your own ego, you forced Alec to cross a log.
There comes a time in every journalist's life when they ask themselves, should I Simba it? Yeah. Should I cross the stream on a log?
Oh, my God. Oh, you okay? Yeah.
Why did you put Alec's life in danger again? Can you tell me that?
Important journalism. We were trying to get into the mind of a salmon. I can imagine if I were a salmon and I were swimming up the stream towards this, I would be pretty into what's going on here.
When you guys left the office the other day, I feel like I must have missed several things about that trip.
It's so obvious. I'm trying to understand the transportation budget. Come on. That's what we do on Sound Politics. Welcome to Sound Politics, a podcast about salmon. I mean, politics in Washington State. And today, that happens to involve salmon. I'm Scott Greenstone, and for the record, I did not make Alec cross the log. He actually fell before he crossed the log. HR, if you're listening.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. I actually don't need to talk to HR today. Coming up on the pod, we're going to try to understand the state's budget issues by digging into one salmon-shaped hole in the budget. But let's put a pin in the salmon thing for a minute, Scott, like a fish hook in the salmon thing.
No.
Because we're a little under 24 hours into the Bob Ferguson era of Washington state politics.
Yeah.
How you feeling? How you doing?
So Ferguson was sworn in as Washington's new governor on Wednesday. And yeah, I did notice something different in the air today.
It's a vibe shift.
Yeah.
Things were a little topsy-turvy in Olympia after his inaugural address. Republicans were the most excited about what this new Democratic governor had to say.
Yeah, he was speaking their love language.
Yeah, if you squinted and covered your ears when he promised to protect access to reproductive care in the state, Ferguson kind of sort of sounded like a Republican. I mean, already last week he put forward a budget proposal with billions of dollars in new cuts over what Jay Inslee had put forward. And then after he swore in, he was talking about slicing through bureaucracy, limiting the governor's emergency powers, and vetoing any budget that relied on unrealistic revenue growth. I mean, here's the actual quote.
Yeah.
I'm not here to defend government. I am here to reform it.
And he got some GOP lawmakers on their feet applauding him.
Right. I thought maybe he was going to rip his suit jacket off and have a Reagan T-shirt underneath. This is
Dan Evans.
Right. Yeah. Actually, he mentioned Dan Evans a bunch in the speech, too. Meanwhile, our pal Jeannie Lindsay reported the Democratic side of the aisle was pretty frosty because, of course, leaders there are talking about new taxes. And this is a huge difference from just a couple of days ago when Republicans were walking out of Jay Inslee's final speech as governor. They're not sad to see him go, obviously. During his farewell, Inslee also threw some shade at his successor, Bob Ferguson, over those proposed budget cuts. He warned that cutting the budget too deep risks sending the state back to, quote, the dark days of the Great Recession.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is extraordinary. Ferguson is coming in and saying, basically, yes, Democrats have more power than ever before in Washington politics, or certainly in the past century. But also, the status quo has gotten us into this huge budget mess. We talked last week about the $12 billion shortfall in the state's operating budget, and that is looming over absolutely everything lawmakers plan to do this session.
Yeah, so Ferguson is positioning himself as this belt-tightening adult in the room. He's almost chastising the past spending habits of the Democratic legislature and Inslee, so they're not going to love it.
I'm glad you brought that up because all the drama is about budgets right now. We've talked on this show about the hole in the operating budget. There's also a hole in the transportation budget, right? At least $6.5 billion through 2031 if significant action isn't taken. I'm reading that from reporting by Ryan Packer at The Urbanist. And like all budget issues, there's so many factors. Gas tax and carbon auction revenues are down. They're not bringing in as much as expected.
Yeah.
But here's a weird one that keeps coming up again and again and just has me scratching my head. And it has to do with, again, transportation budget, human roads, salmon roads, better known as streams, and where they intersect.
Great connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now I know where this is headed.
Yeah.
We're going to Culvert City, aren't we?
We're standing in a stream live from Culvert City, better known as Factoria in Bellevue by I-90. So WashDOT has been working on a few culverts here for a while now, specifically a few choke points on Sunset Creek. And Libby, I just want you to imagine you're on scene with me here.
Okay, closing my eyes.
The reason we're standing in a stream is because today I'm imagining I'm a salmon and I'm swimming through this stream and I get to this road.
Is that salmon sound just you splashing your hand in the stream? You didn't find us. This is salmon, past spawning season.
The salmon run is over. They've already had their babies, right? But just imagine it's a couple months ago, and my imaginary hand salmon is traveling from the Puget Sound through the Ballard Locks, across Lake Washington, and up a slough to get to this part of Sunset Creek.
Scott, you may never say hand salmon on this pod ever again, please.
My imaginary salmon ears can't hear you. But here's what happens. When I get to the interstate, I run into something. It's a tunnel that stretches into the hillside.
And if I were a salmon, I don't think I'd be able to get through. Or at the very least, it would be tough.
And as I stare into the dark hole of this culvert, and I think about how many of these things there are across the whole state, I'm starting to get an idea of why our budget hole is so big.
If we have our geography right, this is the culvert that the state is spending over $110 million to fix.
$110 million for one fish passage.
Yeah, the state has spent around $4 billion on replacing culverts already, and there are so many more that we're still required to do. It's part of a decades-long legal battle over tribal sovereignty and Washington's responsibility for wrecking salmon runs with road construction.
So, Scott, you've gotten to know culverts a little bit better. How many did you go to?
3.
Pretty good. But you know who's been to way more? Seattle Times investigative reporter Mike Riker. He's the real culvert whisperer. We need to understand this whole mess. And luckily, he took pity on us and agreed to swing by the studios. Mike, thank you so much for being on Sound Politics. Welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So really quick, can we rewind? Why is the state undertaking this massive project to replace salmon culverts? Catch us up.
Sure. It goes all the way back to 2001 when a group of 21 Western Washington tribes sued the state because the Department of Transportation's highways block the salmon runs. And it's specifically these culverts. They're either too steep for fish to swim up, or they're perched above the stream so the fish can't jump high enough, or they're too shallow, or there's trash in them because they're not well maintained. All these reasons that the state has essentially blocked fish migration. And the tribes, which have tribal treaty fishing rights, sued the state, and they won a big decision. The case stretched on for like more than a decade. 2013, a federal judge here in Seattle issued an injunction that said the state had to remove all of these barriers. The biggest part of that decision, though, was by 2030, the Department of Transportation had to open up 90% of habitat above the barriers with the most habitat gain available. I know that's a little complicated, but what it boils down to is the state had about 430 culverts that it had to replace by 2030. And we're talking all over Western Washington. And you can imagine the Department of Transportation maintains highways and freeways. Some of these are huge projects, like the one you went to in Bellevue. That's the largest one that's currently under construction. But there are other $100 million, $150 million projects that are planned. And so far, the state spent $4 billion, like you mentioned, and they think they need $5 billion more to do the work.
What has the progress been like so far, Mike? I mean, how many culverts are done and how many still need to be fixed?
Yeah, so the state so far has done about 150. So there are 300 left to do by 2030. But the interesting thing about this injunction is it actually puts the state on the hook for fixing culverts in perpetuity. So even beyond 2030, the state is going to need funds to replace culverts whenever they fail or if the state's doing a construction project and they come across a culvert, they're going to have to make it essentially a natural stream bed under the highway instead of one of these pipes or tunnels which fish can't get through.
Which Scott's hand salmon just had no chance of getting through.
The hand salmon can jump a little bit higher than I think a regular salmon, but yeah. Why is it so expensive to turn these tunnels into streams that the fish can actually swim through?
Yeah, so the state right now is actually taking on the most expensive projects. They kind of got the easy ones done first, the ones with a lot of habitat that are out in rural areas. So now they're moving on to ones with big interchanges and places where they have to build multiple bridges over the stream. So the one in Bellevue, there are 2 bridges on I-90 and 2 bridges on the surface streets next to them. They're also looking at places with poor soil conditions now, which require a lot more engineering. They're doing on-ramps and off-ramps. And then right in the stream itself, they're putting in logs and doing all these natural features that are great for salmon, but all of that really adds up.
Even if the state fixes the culverts on its property, there are a lot of culverts that are on private property. Are there any efforts to get private landowners to address their culverts, Mike?
There is. In fact, the state spends about $25 million a year to give grants to private landowners, cities, counties, railroads, others that have these culverts. But the problem is it's not really well coordinated with the state's effort. So it kind of depends on whoever comes to the state and asks for that money, as opposed to them kind of looking at all the culverts and pushing out the funds in a really coordinated way.
We really zoomed in there, right, because we're talking about a salmon who has gone through a publicly funded culvert under a highway and then gets to private land, and all of a sudden there's like maybe rubble or something blocking their way that the private landowner doesn't have any requirement to remove. But if we zoom out...
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. They actually do have a requirement. There's a law on the books. It's been on the books for decades that says every fish passage barrier is illegal, even if it's on private land or county land. But the state doesn't enforce that law. You could imagine how expensive that would be if they went to like every homeowner and said you have to rip out your culvert and spend, $300,000 to do it. So
a
right
lot of
now,
litigation, maybe.
Yeah. And right now the state is actually developing rules so they can encourage people and actually step up enforcement for those.
Yeah. Well, I do want to zoom out on just, so we're talking about salmon. Salmon are obviously important to the tribes. They're also important, just to the ecosystem. When we look at what's going on with like Telequa, the orca who is carrying her, dead baby, I believe she still is, right? That baby died, and those orcas, the southern resident orcas, are really struggling because the salmon that they eat are not doing well, right? These salmon populations are really struggling. So it's not just salmon, it's not just treaties. I do want to ask, how are the salmon doing? Is this helping them?
Unfortunately, none of the species have come off the endangered species list. So all this funding, all these projects, in some cases are helping, right? They are working in some good salmon habitats. And
some of the runs have come back.
Yeah, and these particular fish passage projects are opening up some important streams. So the science is there. This kind of work actually helps habitat. But in many places, the funding is going to projects that don't help. And that's the problem. Everybody wants the fish to come back. And so how do you target it and how do you coordinate these projects to get the most benefit?
Does the state have any wiggle room about complying with this injunction? I mean, what happens if they just don't do it?
Well, the state does have an ability to make some deals with tribes. And they've done it already with the Puyallup tribe in particular. The Puyallup tribe had 2 projects that were in or right next to their tribal area. And they said, look, you're going to spend $75 million on these projects, but it's not going to get salmon back. They're really developed watersheds. There are other culverts. And the tribe said, but there's this other stream that we really care about, and it would bring back multiple species. And they made a deal with the state to instead invest in that other stream. Now, other tribes protested. There was a handful of tribes that said, no, WSDOT, you can't make those sort of deals unilaterally. And they said, but maybe if you give notice to the other tribes and the deal makes sense, we may be open to doing it. So that's an example of kind of a compromise. There have been some other tribal leaders that have expressed interest in that kind of deal making. But the state is really on the hook to fix all these culverts as the federal injunction is written. So the other option would be to do a broader renegotiation with the tribes. And that is looking to be somewhat more likely as the funding is now a huge issue and the schedule is an issue. WSDOT has now said we are not going to hit that 2030 deadline. There's just too much work to do between now and then. So it's kind of come to a head. The legislators that I've talked to say we really don't have the $5 billion to allocate now. So we'll see how the Ferguson administration handles it. But there have been some talks started with the tribes. The Inslee administration started them last summer to see, how do we continue implementing this injunction, doing these culvert replacements, and possibly doing more deals like the Puyallups did.
So what's next, Mike? I mean, we talked about this budget crunch, which sounds like it's creating a moment of reckoning for how these culverts are going to get repaired and replaced in the future. What do you expect here? The state legislature is going to be writing and trying to balance a transportation budget. This is obviously a big chunk of change over the next several years. Even if the state doesn't meet the deadline, they're still going to be spending a lot of money. What do you predict here for the next steps?
It's really hard to say. I was watching a legislative preview with the four heads of the transportation committees.
That sounds so exciting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thrilling stuff.
You're with friends, Mike.
Great job.
Yeah.
You're amongst like-minded people.
And there was a bit of a discussion about using some of the Climate Commitment Act funds, shifting it over to this work. But the two Democrats, Chair Fye and Leas, the two Democrat chairs.
Marco Leas and Jake Fye.
Correct. They said, no, that's not a proper use of the funds. Those need to be for reducing carbon emissions.
And those receipts are down anyway. I mean, the sales of the carbon allowances aren't bringing in as much as they expected.
Sure, that's right. And the bigger problem with the transportation budget, though, is the gas tax. And though, as vehicles, of course, become more efficient and there are more electric vehicles, those revenues are declining. So the question is, what's the long-term solution for the transportation budget? When it comes to culverts, it's kind of up in the air. I really don't know how. I think the Ferguson administration is going to have to drive this conversation. And maybe they can bring the tribes to the table and make some sort of arrangement where they can do a certain amount of culvert replacements by 2030, maybe not the full list. And maybe set a certain amount that they spend on it each biennium. These are some ideas. And then also maybe do some of these trade-offs, pick the best projects as you have limited funding, which ones actually are going to have the best bang for the buck.
Mm. Can I present like a unifying theory of Washington's budget woes and political woes right now?
Oh my God, please.
It has to do with the fact that we are this environmentally conscious state. We're really lefty. We just had Jay Inslee as governor, for goodness sake. And we have been facing these budget problems that partially have to do with us getting better at our environmental efforts. Like the CCA, the Climate Commitment Act receipts going down, has to do with the fact that the auctions are working better, and the costs of those allowances aren't as high as they were when the gas prices were going up. And now there's going to be linkages with Canada and California. We're also getting more fuel efficient with our cars, and so the fuel tax revenue is not interminably going to go up and up and up. It's starting to decline. And that's a good thing for our environmental state, but it's a really bad thing for the transportation budget. We're making progress on culverts. Culverts, are this huge effort, and they're also busting our budget. I mean, is there something here about Washington doing too well in some of its environmental efforts and then kind of screwing itself on the back end? What do you guys think?
Yeah, it is a great question. I think people really care about salmon in this state, and that's one of the reasons I took on this story. I think it's fascinating, and people want to fix these salmon runs. They want to honor tribal treaty rights, but it's a big problem for the budget, and we don't know how we're going to pay for this. It really comes to a head at a place like the legislature where they have to shift their funding among these priorities, right? I listened to a tribal lawyer at a conference last year who said, the state also has to pay for a lot of programs that the tribes care about. So it's going to cause this really important discussion about priorities in this legislature right now. And we'll see what the lawmakers do with it.
And there's no control over what a judge, orders in a lawsuit, certainly, but there are ways in which we have to have real conversations about where revenue's coming from, and if we're relying on the state to continue to use fuel at a rapid pace, which, is against the ethos of what the legislature is doing, that's probably a bad plan. I mean, we got to get more realistic about that stuff. Mike Riker, thank you so much for being here to walk us through this whole culvert situation. You've been so amazing reporting on this and such an important resource, I think, for people to understand what's actually happening. And we just really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
That's it for Sound Politics today. Today's show was produced by Alec Cowan, who, I did not make him cross a log. He did not cross a log across a stream. He crossed another log, and that was when he fell. But that log was not over the stream, okay?
Wow, this story keeps changing.
And our editor this week was Jed Kim. I'm KUOW politics reporter Scott Greenstone.
Just a public service announcement. No producers were injured in the course of making this podcast. If you are excited to spend 2025 with Sound Politics, oh my gosh, we are too. Please, if you like the show, consider a donation that can help us keep doing it. There's a link in the show notes or at kuow.org/politics to give.
We'll catch you in a week on the next episode of Sound Politics.
Bye, hand salmon.
Goodbye forever.